The chamber was tense, filled with restless whispers, the kind of atmosphere that feels like the air itself is waiting for something to break. Cameras zoomed in, reporters hunched forward, and the audience, both inside the room and across the country watching live, could sense the storm building. Suddenly it happened. Kari Lake's voice erupted like a crack of thunder, slicing through the uneasy silence. "Get out," she screamed, the command echoing across the marble walls with a venom meant to humiliate. Her face tightened, eyes narrowed, every word dripping with entitlement and rage. Gasps rippled across the room. For a heartbeat, it felt as if time itself froze. This was supposed to be Lake's moment, the big, viral outburst that would dominate headlines, the clip she believed would prove her dominance. She leaned forward, confident that volume alone would drown out reason. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, steady, poised, eyes unflinching. Crockett didn't flinch because she didn't need to. In that instant, she embodied a strength that no scream could shake. Where Lake's voice was sharp and jagged, Crockett's silence was solid, unmovable, like bedrock beneath crashing waves. Observers could see it, the calm before the counterstrike. The arrogance of power meeting the quiet fire of dignity. It was a collision not just between two women, but between two Americas. One side clung to volume, outrage, and spectacle. The other carried composure, justice, and a refusal to be diminished. And as the seconds stretched, the imbalance was obvious. Kari Lake had shouted with every ounce of her being, but the power now belonged to the woman who hadn't raised her voice at all. The audience leaned forward. Phones were lifted higher. Reporters held their breath, pens still above notepads. Everyone knew Crockett was about to respond. Everyone knew something was coming. But no one could predict how devastating it would be, because in just a few carefully chosen words, Jasmine Crockett would flip Kari Lake's anger into silence. She would turn the roar of arrogance into the deafening quiet of defeat. And what happened in the next 5 seconds would leave even Kari Lake's own supporters speechless. This moment wasn't just another clash between two politicians. It was a collision of symbols, a test of what kind of politics America would tolerate and what kind it would reject. Kari Lake didn't walk into that room to have a measured discussion. She came to perform, to inflame, to feed a narrative of endless confrontation. Her brand was built on fire and fury, the camera-ready outrage that played well in sound bites but crumbled under real scrutiny. To Lake, volume equaled victory. To her supporters, aggression was authenticity. She wasn't speaking to persuade. She was speaking to dominate. That is why her words carried such venom when she lashed out at Jasmine Crockett. For Lake, every scream was theater. Every sneer was choreography. Her entire political persona relied on convincing her followers that silencing opponents equaled strength. And yet, in that room, with cameras rolling, she was facing someone who didn't play by those rules. Jasmine Crockett represented a different current in American politics, one grounded not in noise, but in substance. A lawyer by training, she knew the value of precision. A black woman in Congress, she carried the weight of representation and the lived knowledge that composure in the face of hostility wasn't just strategy, it was survival. Crockett wasn't just another lawmaker. She had quickly become a rising figure admired for her razor-sharp cross-examinations, her quick wit, and her refusal to bend under pressure. Her strength wasn't found in shouting matches. It was found in the silence she could command, the way her presence alone forced others to reckon with their own insecurity. And so, when Lake screamed, "Get out," it wasn't merely an insult hurled in anger. It was a challenge to the very idea of truth speaking calmly in a storm of rage. Would America's political stage continue rewarding those who screamed the loudest, or would it finally witness the quiet power of dignity prevailing? The stakes stretched far beyond two women and one confrontation. They touched on the future of discourse in this country. Could democracy survive if every debate was reduced to shouting down opponents? Could reasoned voices still break through the static of anger? Or would Lake's brand of performative fury define the way politics would be fought in the years to come? Viewers watching at home could feel the weight of those questions. Social media feeds were already buzzing, clips of the moment spreading before Crockett had even spoken a single word in reply. Commentators were divided. Some claimed Lake had shown strength. Others argued her rage revealed weakness. But everyone knew the confrontation wasn't finished, and Crockett understood something that Lake did not. Rage might grab attention. Anger might make headlines, but it never makes history. History belongs to the words that cut deeper than noise, the words that can't be ignored, the words that revealed truth even in the midst of chaos. That was what made this moment electric. What made every viewer lean forward, waiting? Kari Lake had tried to shout her opponent into silence, but silence was precisely the weapon Crockett wielded with the most devastating precision. The seconds after Lake's eruption felt longer than minutes. Crockett's eyes narrowed, her lips parted, and the anticipation reached a breaking point. Because this wasn't just another heated exchange. What Crockett said next turned Kari Lake's fury into stunned silence, before the shouting match that sent shockwaves across the nation. Kari Lake was already a household name. Her face had been familiar to millions, not as a politician, but as a television anchor in Arizona. For years, she projected warmth and reliability, the friendly voice delivering evening news. Viewers trusted her, admired her poise, and tuned in nightly to hear her spin the day's events into digestible stories. But behind that polished smile was a deep hunger for more. A hunger for influence that couldn't be satisfied by reading a teleprompter. When she left journalism, she reinvented herself almost overnight. The shift was jarring. The once polished broadcaster who traded in neutrality re-emerged as a full-throated partisan warrior. Kari Lake wasn't just dabbling in politics. She was charging headfirst into the most divisive corners of America's culture wars. Her 2022 run for governor of Arizona became the stage on which she transformed herself from trusted newswoman into MAGA firebrand. Her campaign was built not on policy nuance, but on sound bites designed to ignite outrage. She railed against the press, the very industry that had once elevated her. She accused elections of being rigged before a single ballot was cast. She courted conspiracy theories like they were old friends, weaving them into every speech and interview. Her rallies weren't conversations. They were performances built on volume, defiance, and spectacle. To her supporters, she was fearless. To her critics, she was reckless. Lake's style became unmistakable. Raise your voice, interrupt relentlessly, refuse to answer directly, and always play to the cameras. If an opponent tried to reason with her, she cut them off. If a journalist pressed her for facts, she mocked them. If anyone dared challenge her authority, she escalated until she drowned them out. Manufactured outrage wasn't just her tactic, it was her currency. And in the social media age, that currency spread like wildfire, clips of her shouting down. Reporters went viral. Fans celebrated her strength, while opponents warned that she was dismantling democratic norms. One soundbite at a time, but beneath that bravado lay contradictions she could never fully mask. The woman who once embodied professionalism now made headlines for attacking the very idea of a free press. The former journalist who once told viewers to trust the facts now cast doubt on every institution that didn't serve her narrative. She demanded loyalty while sneering at accountability. The shift revealed not just ambition, but insecurity. The gnawing fear that substance could never match spectacle. Observers noticed that Lake seemed most alive when the cameras were rolling. Her confidence soared under the bright lights, her voice sharper, her gestures more exaggerated. But offstage, whispers painted a different picture. A figure whose certainty was brittle, whose dominance depended entirely on keeping others off. Balance. It's like a stage actor terrified of silence. She needed the noise, the applause, the validation of her audience. It was that insecurity that drove her most infamous moments. Rather than debating with ideas, she went for humiliation. Rather than persuading, she performed. The arrogance was always front and center, but so was the desperation hiding behind it. And that arrogance followed her into every chamber she entered, including the one where Jasmine Crockett sat across from her. To Lake, every opponent was just another target to bulldoze, another chance to prove that shouting equaled strength. She didn't prepare for thoughtful rebuttals, because she didn't think she needed to. Her formula had worked before: cut them off, raise your voice, and walk away with the viral clip. But that formula was about to falter, because Crockett was not another pundit, nor a reporter desperate for airtime. She was a woman forged in the courtroom, sharpened by years of fighting for those without power, and trained to remain unshaken no matter how loud the storm became. Kari Lake had built her brand on shouting others down, but she had never met someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Kari Lake in a room charged with tension, she had already walked through fire. Her story didn't begin with headlines or congressional hearings. It began in the working-class neighborhoods, where struggle was a daily reality and grit was the only inheritance a young girl could count on. Crockett grew up knowing that nothing would be handed to her, that every victory, every opportunity, would have to be fought for and earned through resilience. From an early age, she was drawn to the law. She saw how rules could be twisted against people who lacked power, how entire systems seemed designed to keep certain voices out. While other kids dreamed of fame or fortune, Jasmine dreamed of standing in courtrooms, armed not with money or privilege, but with her mind and her voice. That vision fueled her through long nights of study, part-time jobs. It's a kind of quiet sacrifices that rarely make it into political speeches, but shape character more than anything else. When she finally became a lawyer, Crockett didn't seek cushy firms or corporate prestige. She went where she was needed most, into courtrooms where ordinary people fought for their freedom, their dignity, and their chance to be heard. As a public defender, she stood beside those society too often abandoned. Every case taught her how to stay calm under fire, how to dismantle the arrogance of prosecutors with precision, and how to remind juries that justice wasn't an abstract principle, but a human need. Her courtroom battles hardened her without hardening her heart. She learned the art of silence, how to let an opponent's arrogance hang in the air until it collapsed under its own weight. She learned to watch for the flicker in someone's eyes when their confidence gave way to doubt. She learned that the sharpest blade in debate was not anger, but composure. But Crockett wasn't content to stop at defending individuals one case at a time. She saw patterns, how poverty, race, and systemic injustice chained countless people before they'd even stepped into a courtroom. That realization pulled her toward public service, first in her community, then in the political arena. To her, politics wasn't theater, it was the extension of the same fight she'd been waging her entire career. The fight to make sure no one could be silenced simply because they lacked wealth, connections, or privilege. Her entry into Congress was no accident of timing. It was the culmination of years spent proving that she would not bend, that her strength lay in dignity rather than bluster. Colleagues quickly noticed her razor-sharp questioning during hearings, her refusal to be intimidated by louder voices, and her ability to cut through spin with the clarity of a scalpel. Where others saw chaos, Crockett saw opportunity. Where others faltered in the face of aggression, she thrived. Her supporters didn't just admire her intelligence, they admired her presence. In a political landscape dominated by shouting matches and staged outrage, Crockett embodied something rare: calm authority. She reminded people of the teachers, mothers, and mentors who had carried them through hard times. She reminded them of the strength found in patience, the dignity in restraint, the power in being unshakable. To watch her work was to feel represented, not just politically, but emotionally, and that sense of representation mattered deeply. For many, Crockett symbolized a voice long denied space in America's halls of power. She carried herself as if she belonged there because she did, and in doing so, she gave others permission to believe they belonged too. Her story was not just her own. It was woven into the larger story of communities that had been told to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay invisible. That was why her rise resonated so profoundly. She wasn't polished for television like Kari Lake had been. She wasn't manufactured. In a political lab, she was real, her scars visible, her grit undeniable. And in every confrontation, that authenticity shone through. So when she found herself across from Kari Lake, Facing a woman who wielded rage like a weapon, Crockett didn't panic. She had been here before, though in different forms, facing down. Prosecutors who mocked her clients, standing before judges who underestimated her, arguing against systems that seemed immovable. Each battle had prepared her for the next. Each scar had turned into armor. Each silence she endured became fuel for her resolve. All of those years in the courtroom prepared her, the moment when Kari Lake would try to silence her with one command. The hearing had already been tense before Kari Lake opened her mouth. The room was filled with the hum of whispered conversations, the flick of pens against notepads, and the low whir of cameras recording every second. Everyone knew Lake's presence meant fireworks, but few expected the match to ignite so quickly. From the moment Jasmine Crockett began to speak, Lake was restless. She shifted in her chair, arms crossed tightly, eyes rolling at every phrase. It wasn't long before the interruptions began. "That's not true," Lake blurted out, her voice sharp and cutting. Crockett barely paused, continuing her remarks with the calm cadence of someone who had been interrupted 1,000 times before, and refused to let noise dictate the rhythm of her voice. But Lake wasn't finished. Each time Crockett attempted to lay out a point, Lake would pounce, mocking her tone, questioning her intelligence, tossing out dismissive asides loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Oh, please," she sneered at one point, throwing her head back with theatrical disdain. The words weren't just aimed at Crockett. They were meant for the cameras, a performance crafted for viral outrage. And yet, the contrast only grew sharper. Where Lake's voice rose, Crockett stayed steady. Where Lake flailed her arms in frustration, Crockett's hands rested calmly on the table. Her composure was unnerving to her opponent, almost infuriating. Lake wanted a shouting match. Crockett refused to give her one. Observers could feel the imbalance. Reporters glanced at each other, recognizing the spectacle taking shape. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, some smirking, others shaking their heads. The audience beyond the chamber, the millions watching online, felt the clash of styles viscerally. On one side, a woman wielding volume like a club. On the other, a woman wielding restraint like a shield. The more Crockett refused to be rattled, the more Lake spiraled. Her voice grew louder, sharper, her interruptions closer together. She cut Crockett off mid-sentence, snapping, "You don't even know what you're talking about." Crockett turned her head slightly, fixing Lake with a gaze that was calm but piercing. Without raising her voice, she replied, "If you're afraid of facts, that's your problem. But you won't drown me out." The line landed like a quiet thunderclap. The chamber stirred, a wave of murmurs breaking across the room. Lake's face flushed crimson. Crockett had not insulted her, had not matched rage with rage. She had simply asserted her right to be heard. And in that moment, it was clear composure was more powerful than volume. But Lake was not the type to back down gracefully. Her interruptions became less about argument and more about raw dominance. She leaned forward across the table, her words spilling out in a torrent of scorn. "You think you're tough? You think you can come in here and lecture me?" Her voice cracked with the strain of anger, each syllable punctuated like a blow. Crockett didn't flinch. Her words flowed with the calm authority of someone who understood that the entire room, the entire nation, was watching not just what she said, but how she carried herself while saying it. She was deliberate, unshaken, her voice steady as stone against the storm battering around her. The tension became unbearable. It wasn't just an exchange anymore, it was a duel. Every pause stretched longer, every word carried more weight. Camera lenses zoomed in close, catching every twitch of Lake's fury and every flicker of Crockett's composure. Then came the moment no one would forget. Lake's restraint snapped like a brittle branch. Her eyes burned with frustration. Her hands slammed against the table, and she leaned forward until her voice was almost a scream. "Get out!" she thundered, the command ricocheting off the chamber walls with a force that startled even her allies. The room went silent, the air thick with shock. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. Then came the breaking point. Lake leaned forward, face burning with anger, and screamed, "Get out!" The word "out" was still echoing against the marble walls when the silence fell. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of shock, a charged, heavy quiet that clung to the chamber like smoke after an explosion. Lawmakers froze in their seats, eyes darting between the two women. Reporters stopped scribbling mid-sentence. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, their lenses locked on Jasmine Crockett. For a long moment she did nothing. She didn't flinch, didn't glance away, didn't let her composure slip by even a fraction. Her stillness was deliberate, her silence louder than Lake's thunder. The longer she waited, the more unbearable the quiet became. Kari Lake, once so sure of her dominance, suddenly seemed exposed. Crockett leaned back slightly, her gaze steady, her lips pressed in the faintest trace of a smile, not mocking, not smug, but confident. The kind of smile that comes from knowing the truth doesn't need to be shouted. And then, with a voice so measured that every syllable sliced through the tension like a scalpel, she spoke. "Miss Lake," she began, her tone calm yet resonant, "you can shout at me all you want. You can try to order me out of this room, but I was elected to serve here, just as you were invited to testify. And unlike you, I don't confuse volume with value." The words landed with surgical precision. The chamber stirred, a ripple of gasps and murmurs moving like a current through the audience. Crockett's voice was not raised, but it carried, steady as a drumbeat, undeniable in its weight. Lake shifted in her chair, the flush on her face deepening. She opened her mouth to interject, but Crockett continued without hesitation. Her voice a steady current rolling forward. "You see, the difference between us is simple. You believe power comes from drowning people out. I believe power comes from being heard despite the noise. And the truth is, you can't silence me. You can't silence the people I represent, and you will never silence justice." The words fell like hammers, each one driving Lake further into the corner she had built for herself. The audience was riveted. Her attention snapped away from Lake's theatrics and locked entirely on Crockett's.com fire. Even Lake's allies, who moments earlier had cheered her aggression, sat back in stunned silence. They could see it, the shift, the unraveling of their champion's facade. The shouting had lost its edge. The room now belonged to Crockett. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into an almost intimate register, forcing everyone to listen closer. "You told me to get out. But let's be clear, what you really wanted was for the truth too. Leave, and I don't walk out on the truth." The chamber erupted, not in noise, but in a kind of invisible electricity. The line was devastating, not because it was cruel, but because it was undeniable. Crockett had reframed Lake's outburst, exposing it not as strength, but as fear. Lake shifted again, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes darting toward the cameras. But no sound came. For once, Kari Lake, the woman who always had a comeback, always had a quip, had nothing, and Crockett wasn't finished. She let the silence hang for a beat longer before delivering the final blow. "If your argument had merit, you wouldn't need to scream.
Ow.
If your vision had substance, you wouldn't fear my words. And if your cause had justice on its side, you wouldn't have to tell anyone to get out." The room shook with murmurs, gasps, and even a few smothered chuckles from those who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, knowing instinctively that this moment would dominate headlines. Lake tried again to speak, but Crockett raised her hand, not abruptly, but with the graceful authority of a judge quieting a courtroom. "No," she said softly, "you've had your turn. Now, it's my turn to be heard." That was the killing blow. Not anger, not insult, but restraint wielded as a weapon. The quiet strength of Crockett's demeanor dismantled the loud fury of her opponent. It was cinematic justice in real time, arrogance undone by composure. For those in the room, it was unforgettable. The lawmakers who had seen 1,000 debates before knew they had just witnessed something singular. The reporters who had chased countless controversies knew this clip would live far beyond a single news cycle. And the viewers at home, sitting in front of their screens, felt something deeper: validation, a reminder that dignity still had a place in politics, that strength didn't have to shout to be heard. The camera panned across the chamber, capturing faces frozen in astonishment. Some looked at Crockett with admiration, others at Lake with disbelief. Even those who disagreed with Crockett politically couldn't deny what had just happened. A woman who had built her brand on shouting had been silenced without a raised voice. The moment was pure poetry. It's a kind of unscripted drama that no speechwriter could have planned and no spin doctor could undo. Crockett had seized the stage, not by overpowering, but by standing firm. She had reminded the country that justice does not need theatrics, only truth spoken with courage. And yet, as powerful as that moment was inside the room, it was only the beginning. Because when the cameras carried Crockett's words beyond those walls, when clips began spreading across Twitter, TikTok, and late-night television, the effect multiplied 1,000-fold. What had been a chamber confrontation was about to become a national spectacle. But the real shockwave wasn't in that room. It was what happened once the clip hit the internet. The moment the clip hit the internet, it spread like wildfire. Within minutes, timelines were flooded with the now iconic exchange. Kari Lake's face twisted in fury, her voice cracking as she yelled, "Get out!" followed by Jasmine Crockett's devastatingly calm reply. The contrast was cinematic, and America couldn't stop replaying it. On Twitter, the hashtags appeared almost instantly. Hashtag Crockett Clapback began trending nationwide, followed closely by hashtag Lake Speechless. The irony was too delicious for the public to ignore. Kari Lake, the politician, who never missed a chance to shout down her critics, had been silenced not by force, but by poise. Millions shared the clip with captions like, "This is how you handle a bully," and "Dignity will always outlast arrogance." TikTok creators wasted no time putting their spin on it. Some remixed the moment with dramatic movie soundtracks, Hans Zimmer crescendos swelling behind Crockett's calm words. Others froze the frame on Lake's stunned expression, captioning it with lines like, "When you realize yelling isn't an argument." The clip racked up tens of millions of views in less than 24 hours, crossing generational divides as both young activists and seasoned commentators amplified it. Memes exploded across platforms. One viral post showed a picture of Crockett standing, calmly captioned, "Unbothered, untouchable, unforgettable." Another placed Lake's red-faced scream next to a toddler's tantrum with the words, "Spot the difference." Even late-night comedians joined in, weaving the confrontation into their monologues. Kari Lake told Jasmine Crockett to get out, one joked, but it turns out Crockett's dignity was the one thing that refused to leave. But it wasn't just comedy. For many, the moment was cathartic. Supporters flooded Crockett's pages with messages of gratitude. "Thank you for standing up for us. You gave me hope tonight. Showed my daughters what strength." Looks like the clip wasn't merely entertainment. It became validation for those who had long felt drowned out by the noise of outrage politics. Political analysts quickly joined the chorus. On cable news, panelists dissected the exchange with the seriousness of a historic event. One strategist observed, this wasn't just a comeback line. It was a turning point in how America views both women. Kari Lake leaned into her brand of fire and fury. But what the public saw was desperation. Jasmine Crockett, in contrast, came across as composed, unshakable, and principled. That contrast will stick, another analyst added. Moments like these define careers. For Lake, it reinforces the idea that she's more performer than leader. For Crockett, it cements her as a rising voice of dignity and truth in American politics. What made the moment resonate so deeply was that it wasn't contrived. Crockett hadn't rehearsed a viral line. She had simply responded with composure. In an era where authenticity feels rare, that authenticity struck a chord. People recognized the difference between a staged outburst and a genuine show of strength, and they rewarded it with their attention. Within days, the confrontation was everywhere. Highlighted in YouTube compilations, broken down in Instagram reels, quoted in op-eds. Editorial boards praised Crockett's.com under fire, framing it as an example of how political discourse should be conducted. Meanwhile, Lake's outburst was replayed endlessly. Her red-faced anger turned into a cautionary tale about the emptiness of performative politics. For Crockett's supporters, it was more than a win. It was a cultural moment, A declaration that grace under pressure could still capture America's imagination. A reminder that the truth doesn't always need to shout to be heard. And yet, Jasmine Crockett didn't treat it as a personal victory. She didn't gloat, didn't revel in the memes, didn't turn the moment into a self-congratulatory tour. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She shifted the spotlight away from herself and onto the values she represented. She framed the clash not as a battle of personalities, but as a lesson about dignity, justice, and the future of America's political discourse. And that choice transformed the moment from viral clip to moral compass. Because Crockett didn't leave it at a personal victory. She turned it into something much bigger. When the noise died down and the memes began to fade from the front page of the internet, Jasmine Crockett's words lingered. They weren't just clever, they were timeless. She reminded America of something it desperately needed to hear. You can shout down people, but you can't shout down dignity. It was more than a rebuttal to Kari Lake. It was a truth that cut across party lines, across generations, across every community tired of watching rage be rewarded over reason, because that was the heart of it. Anger burns hot and fast, but it burns out. Dignity, however, lasts. Dignity is what remains when the yelling stops, when the cameras turn off, when the headlines move on. It is the steady light that doesn't flicker, no matter how strong the storm. And in that hearing room, Crockett had carried that light, refusing to let Lake's fury extinguish it. The moral was unmistakable. Kari Lake showed America what arrogance looks like when it runs out of substance. Jasmine Crockett showed America what strength looks like when it doesn't need to raise its voice. That contrast was seared into the public imagination, not because of a single viral moment, but because it reflected a choice every citizen faces daily. Do we feed the fire of outrage, or do we stand in the quiet strength of dignity? Historians and commentators reached for comparisons. Some likened Crockett to John Lewis, who taught the nation about good trouble through quiet persistence. Others saw echoes of Shirley Chisholm, who stood unbought and unbossed against the political machine of her time. Still others drew parallels to Barack Obama's ability to stay measured, even under relentless attack. Crockett, in that instant, carried forward their legacy. Grace under fire, truth over volume, and it mattered. Not just for the clash of personalities, but for the larger question hanging over American politics. What kind of leaders do we want to elevate? The ones who confuse volume with vision, or the ones who show that true power doesn't come from who can yell the loudest, but from who can stay standing when shouted at? This wasn't about Kari Lake, and it wasn't even just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about who we want to be as a nation. Do we want to normalize screaming as strategy, or do we want to uplift dignity as destiny? Crockett's calm defiance posed that question to millions, and the reaction showed that Americans are hungrier for dignity than cynics think. In living rooms, in classrooms, families replayed the clip not to laugh at Lake's tantrum, but to admire Crockett's composure. Teachers shared it as a lesson in self-control. Parents pointed to it as proof that dignity can disarm even the loudest bully. The moral radiated outward, touching spaces far removed from politics, reminding people that calm strength isn't weakness, it's power. And as the moment settled into America's collective memory, it became clear that Crockett hadn't just won an argument, she had drawn a line in the sand. Anger may dominate for a night, but dignity defines an era. She didn't need to outshout Kari Lake. She didn't need to match fury with fury. She only needed to stand her ground and let the truth speak for itself. That was enough to shift the atmosphere, to turn rage into silence, to remind America that even in a world addicted to noise, composure can still carry the day. And Crockett made sure the country would remember her words long after Kari Lake's shouting faded. Kari Lake yelled for Jasmine Crockett to get out. But in the end, it was Lake who was pushed to the margins, her rage swallowed by the calm force of Crockett's words. The command meant to silence instead became the spark that revealed just how irrelevant Lake's anger truly was. Crockett didn't just stay in the room. She owned it. That's the power of dignity. It doesn't shout. It doesn't flail. It doesn't try to overwhelm. It It simply stands unshaken until arrogance collapses under its own weight. In that hearing room, America witnessed a reminder that the loudest voice isn't always the strongest. The calmest one often is. And now the question moves to us. What do we choose to amplify? The tantrums that burn out in seconds, or the truths that endure for generations? If you believe dignity is stronger than arrogance, share the story. Let Crockett's composure echo louder than Lake's fury. Pass it on so others can see that strength doesn't come from volume, it comes from values. Subscribe for more moments where truth takes the mic back, where justice refuses to be shouted down, and where dignity rises above chaos. These are not just viral clips, they're lessons in the kind of nation we want to build, because history is watching. And so are we.